What's going on, guys? It's Zach here, bringing you guys another fantasy football video. This will be going over about 5 or 6 players specifically that I've been looking to sell high on ahead of Week 11. Then I'm going to sort of take a bit of a deeper dive in terms of looking at players that have either really bad schedules over the next month or so the next month before we get into those fantasy playoffs. And then I'll be looking at players that also have some really bad fantasy playoff schedules so that I can sort of help you guys understand which players should and shouldn't be on your rosters depending upon what you need. If you're 3-7, 4-6, and you need to win out, and somebody's got a really bad schedule over the next month, then obviously it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for them to be on your roster because they're not going to help you get into the playoffs. At the same time, if you're 8-2, 7-3, and you know you're going to make the playoffs anyway, you got a couple players that have really bad playoff schedules. It's going to be really helpful to know which ones of those guys you should offload because obviously you're going to make the playoffs. You want to be putting up high numbers when you get there, and if you can get extra value out of a player that's not necessarily going to contribute for you once those playoffs come, it's helpful to understand what those playoff matchups are going to be because a lot of other fantasy managers just aren't going to look ahead to that playoff schedule. They aren't going to understand what's going to happen once those playoffs come, and you having prepared for that from this point forward is going to help you guys just have like a 4-week edge on everyone else at this point. So it's going to be really helpful. It's one of my favorite things to do, one of my favorite times of the year in fantasy because we got those trade deadlines coming up. It's really sort of time to start looking into those playoff schedules and understanding where we are as our fantasy rosters are built and sort of seeing what we need to do specifically either to make sure we get into those playoffs or make sure that we're as poised as possible to dominate once those playoffs hit. So as always, if you guys have any specific trade questions, just let me know in the comments. I'd love helping you guys navigate these trade waters and hopefully make some trades that can help you guys win your leagues this season. So it's going to be a lot of fun. And yeah, with that, let's just get into the first player here. So starting things off here, it's a pretty really just screaming sell high for me right now, and I've actually talked about him a little bit earlier in the year, about week 5 or week 6 even. I mentioned that they've got the Seahawks have a really brutal stretch of football coming up here. They play in Los Angeles against the Rams, against the 49ers in Seattle, in Dallas, in San Francisco. They host the Eagles. They play in Tennessee and they host the Steelers. There's a legitimate there's a legitimate argument you could make that the Seahawks could easily lose every single one of those games. Obviously, the Seahawks are a relatively decent team. They're 6-3 at this point. They're by no means a bad football team, so they'll probably win one or two between the Rams, Titans, and Steelers. I don't think it's a stretch at all, though, to say they're going to lose those 4 straight between the 2 Niners games, the Cowboys, and the Eagles. Probably going to put them at going 1-6 or 2-5 over the next 7 weeks. That's going to be a really brutal stretch of football for them and for Kenneth Walker, who's actually been outsnapped by Zach Charbonnet 3 weeks in a row. Charbonnet's the guy that was on the field for both of the 2-minute drill situations the Seahawks had this last week. That means Walker's just not featured in the passing game. I know he had a 65-yard receiving touchdown this week, but that was his only catch of the day. And if they're in a lot of situations here, which I expect over the next month or so, or even 2 months, where the Seahawks are going to be trailing in a lot of games, they might have to get into a situation where they really just can't run the ball the way they want to, especially against these tough teams like the Niners, Cowboys, Eagles. Those are going to be matchups where they're just really not going to be able to run the ball effectively. And when that happens, it's going to be a lot of Zach Charbonnet, a lot of pass up tempo, throwing the ball with Geno Smith, and that's going to mean that Kenneth Walker's just not really going to contribute at a high level in fantasy. We've seen over the last several weeks there have been some dud performances for Kenneth Walker when he doesn't break that big play. Obviously, if he's losing snaps, there's less opportunities for him to make that big play happen. And against really great defenses, it's even less likely. So I don't view Kenneth Walker as a running back 1 the rest of the way. I know he's been that so far this season, but if you can get running back 1 value for Kenneth Walker, I'd certainly be willing to do that. There are a lot of players that I think are viewed as a lot lesser than him. I talked about Isaiah Pacheco in the buy low video. I'd personally rather have Pacheco than Kenneth Walker the rest of the season. I know that sounds like a hot take, but there are a lot of players that I think are viewed as significantly lesser than Kenneth Walker, and I would much rather have than Kenneth Walker the rest of the way. So I think now is a great time to sell high on Walker. You're going to get really good value after this last big week from him, and I don't think you're going to be getting by any means like pennies on the dollar for him, but I think it's definitely time to make sure you move on because this tough schedule is coming. Maybe he puts up a good performance against the Rams, who aren't exactly a brutal matchup, but after that, you're looking at like 5 straight weeks of teams that you just can't run the football against at all. So I'd certainly look to move off of Kenneth Walker now if I could. Next, I want to mention George Kittle. George Kittle sort of has been very predictable over the last several years of his fantasy football career, where he basically puts up a big game or two once every single month, and then he's basically invisible otherwise. It's time to sell after putting up a big game. He had 3 catches for over 100 yards and scored a touchdown. Key number there to me is the 3 receptions. Obviously, he's not just a focal point of this offense. He's just not necessary. They've got obviously 2 elite receivers in Deebo Samuel and Brandon Ayuk. Just Christian McCaffrey is obviously the focal point of the offense. And then George Kittle is basically the fourth option here. He's got 4 games this season with 6 PPR points or less. In PPR, getting 6 PPR points or less is just absolutely awful. That's basically him goosing you from the tight end position. And you drafted him to be a difference maker for you at the tight end position. And I think he's much more of a best ball tight end for me. He's not someone that I want to be dealing with every single week because you feel like you have to play him. But when you get into the playoffs, if you put up a 0 from your tight end position, which George Kittle is certainly capable of doing, you're probably going to lose, and we can't afford any of those like really low floor games out of a guy like this, especially if we're expecting big things from. So if you can get a weekly difference maker, if you can get a wide receiver 2 or a running back 2 for George Kittle, I think I would do that because I just don't trust him the rest of the way. There's also just a lot of tight ends that I think are relatively cheaper that I would just much prefer the rest of the way. I prefer guys like Laporta, Dalton Kincaid, even Trey McBride the rest of the season. Those are guys that I think are going to put up better performances than him the rest of the way, and he's not going to be nearly as valuable as those guys. So if you could trade him for a Dalton Kincaid plus or a Trey McBride plus over running back 2, that's something that I would absolutely do and something that I think you can get done as well. Next, I want to talk about Davante Adams. The Raiders just very clearly want to lean on their defense and their running game. They've got a rookie quarterback under center. They've won 2 games in a row playing that brand of football where they're just leaning on their defense and Max Crosby and then giving Josh Jacobs 25 to 30 touches a game. And the real issue here for me is that Davante Adams put up 14.6 PPR fantasy points. He had 6 catches for 86 yards, and everyone feels like it was a breakout game. Like we've got a breath of fresh air or a big, huge sigh of relief because he got 14.6 PPR points. He had 11.5 not half PPR points. That's not something that we should be excited about from a guy that we drafted in the first round. They've also just got a really brutal schedule over the next 3 weeks. They play Miami, who now have Jalen Ramsey backs with Jalen Ramsey and Xavier Howard. The Dolphins really are a high-end pass defense. They play the Chiefs, who have been one of the best defenses in the NFL all season, and they've got a bye. So the next 3 weeks of the Raiders, I don't think Davante Adams is going to be a huge contributor for you. So especially if you're in a situation where you don't know for sure that you're making the playoffs, Davante Adams, I don't think is going to be a guy that's going to help you get there. So if you're in a situation where you need to win out, or if you're 5-5 even, or 6-4 even, I don't think Davante Adams is someone that I want on my roster because he's obviously a high value asset, somebody that I still think you can get a lot for, but I don't think he's going to be a huge difference maker for you for the next month. And even that playoff schedule is not good enough, and the brand of football they want to play is just not something that's going to be very conducive to Davante Adams putting up big games. So I think I'd like to move on from him if I can. Still high on the Raiders are turning the corner. They've won 2 games in a row. Adams just caught 6 passes, had about 90 receiving yards. You could sell high on that, but I just don't see really any sort of ceiling in this offense and the way they want to play football right now. Next, I want to talk about Brian Robinson Jr. I talked about him last week as a sell high, and obviously that aged great. I believe he finished the week as the running back 1 in fantasy, so not great timing on that one, but I want to talk about him again. He just continues to score touchdowns. Obviously, he had a 50-yard receiving touchdown this last week, and that's what's weird for Brian Robinson. He's just not a guy that's featured in the passing game by any means, but he still caught 6 passes, had 100-plus yards and a touchdown. That is not something that I'm expecting Brian Robinson to do very often. He still ran less routes than Antonio Gibson. He's not a running back that we can count on for reliable receiving production. It's the first time in his career he's actually put up a game anywhere near like this. It's probably going to be the best receiving game of his career by the time he retires. It's just not something that I would expect to continue going forward. Antonio Gibson again got it done as a pass catcher as well, and he's a guy that they are going to want to lean on when they are trailing in games and when they really want to air it out. So Gibson's a guy that I still think profiles to be the pass catching running back here. Brian Robinson's a guy that's basically going to be a touchdown or bust running back 2. He does have a great matchup in Week 11. They play the New York Giants, who are by no means a scary matchup. So if you want to let him just beat up on the Giants defense, probably get 20 carries for 80 or 90 yards, probably scores a touchdown this week, and then if you want to flip him, I've got no problem doing that. I think Brian Robinson's a great play this week. He's probably a top 15 running back on the week, but I think after that, they've got a really brutal schedule going forward. You're probably going to see a lot of losing in Washington going forward, and it's going to mean a lot of Antonio Gibson and a lot less Brian Robinson. So keep in mind what your trade deadline is in your league. If it is this week, I think now is the week to trade Brian Robinson. But if it's next week or later, then I would definitely look to maybe potentially hold Brian Robinson through this week, get one more good matchup, and then sell him then. And then last, we've got a potentially contradictory one here, or controversial one here in TJ Hawkinson. I do want to mention him as a potential sell high. He put up a monster performance in Week 10, obviously. He had 11 receptions for, I want to say, 132 yards and a touchdown. Obviously, there are very few tight ends in the NFL that can even put up performances like that, so we know TJ Hawkinson's an elite tight end asset in fantasy. He's probably a top 3 to 5 tight end the rest of the season. I'm not doubting that by any means, but right now he's scored more points on the season than any other tight end so far. I don't think he's going to be the tight end 1 when the season's all said and done. Justin Jefferson's set to return as soon as this week. They've got a sort of sneaky tough matchup against the Denver Broncos. They've been a lot better on defense lately. And on top of that, he's going to be the number 2 target in an offense that just likely can't sustain this level of production. Joshua Dobbs is obviously a very fun story. I think he's a talented enough quarterback to keep this offense afloat, but I wouldn't expect very many high-end performances out of Joshua Dobbs. You're not going to see those like 300-yard passing performances that Kirk Cousins was doing on a regular basis. And when you're going to be the number 2 target in an offense that's probably throwing for 250 yards a game, it's just tough to be an elite fantasy option. I think he's probably going to end up as the tight end 3 on the season behind Andrews and Kelsey. And if you can trade him for anything more than that, I think it makes a lot of sense to at least kick the tires on it. I think there are going to be a lot of people out there that think, hey, Josh Dobbs is targeting the tight end position a ton in Minnesota, just like he did in Arizona. There's a chance here that TJ Hawkins just ends up being the tight end one on the season, and that is possible, but it's not something that I necessarily buy into. So if you can get like tight end one overall value for Hawkinson, it's definitely something that I would consider moving off of. And next, I just wanted to take a bit of a deep dive into some of the worst playoff schedules, players that just have really brutal schedules in weeks 15, 16, and 17, because these are guys that I think if you have on your roster, it does make some sense to consider dumping them. They've got really tough matchups, and I just don't think they're going to be able to help you the way that you're expecting them to once those playoffs come around. So we'll start things off with Alvin Kamara. He does have a really great matchup in week 15 against the New York Giants. So that's great. He'll probably help you get to the second round of the playoffs. But after that, he plays the Rams, who are a tough matchup, and then the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. The Buccaneers are a team that you really just can't run in at all. So Kamara's likely going to have a down week, especially in the fantasy championship. Obviously, Kamara is effective enough as a pass catching running back. He'll still be fine, but you're not going to get like that high end boom performance out of Alvin Kamara. Obviously, they're on bye right now, so it's sort of tough to trade Alvin Kamara. But I just think that if you're looking for somebody that you really want to help take you over the top, if you can get like a top 5 running back value return on Kamara, I would definitely consider doing that. Saquon Barkley, I think he's the big one for me here. I'm kind of panicking a bit with Saquon Barkley. I've got him in a couple leagues. I think he has a good week this week against the Commanders, so I'm not necessarily scared there. But then he gets the Patriots, who aren't awful against the run, and then a bye. And then after that, when you get into the fantasy playoffs, he plays the Saints, the Eagles, and the Rams. Those are 3 really tough matchups. And with Tommy DeVito under center, this offense just doesn't look like a professional offense. They can't move the ball. You're really hoping that Tyrod Taylor comes back at some point, and having to hope for that for Saquon Barkley would be relevant. It's certainly something that I'm scared of. If you can get any sort of running back one value at all out of Saquon Barkley, I think I would strongly consider it. There's always the risk of injury with him, especially given how much he's being featured in this offense. I know he's a really talented player. He's obviously going to get a ton of touches, but it's tough for him to be efficient when defenses can just stack the box against him. They can't even throw the ball to him really effectively right now. They can't get him in open space just because there's nobody else that scares the defense at all. So I'm panicking a bit. It's a really brutal playoff schedule. I don't see a world where he ends up being like a difference maker for you in the playoffs. So if you can move off him and get a running back one return, I think I would do that for basically any running back one. I mentioned in the buy low video, I've tried to trade him for a guy like DeAndre Swift. I tried to trade him plus to get Bijan Robinson. These are trades that I definitely consider making, and if you can make those trades, I would certainly do that. On top of that, I want to mention James Conner. I know I really like him going forward just because he's obviously got a really solid role, and I do think he's a bit undervalued right now. But I do want to mention that he's got a really tough playoff schedule, especially weeks 15 and 17. Week 16 is pretty good for him against the Chicago Bears, but he plays the 49ers, who are obviously an elite defense. We saw what they did to Travis Etienne this last week. And they play the Eagles in week 17, who are just arguably the worst defense in the NFL to be having to face. It's just really tough. They have one of the best run defenses in the league, if not the best, and it's going to be a tough matchup there. So you're hoping he catches a few passes or potentially falls in the end zone. So maybe you play James Conner for a couple weeks. Hopefully your trade deadline's a little bit later. You get a couple high-end performances out of him, and then you move off him because I think getting into the playoffs is going to be good with him. But after that, I don't think he's going to be a huge difference maker for you once you get there. I'm just going to mention the entire Dolphins offense. They've got 3 straight really tough defensive matchups in the playoffs. They play the Jets, the Cowboys, and the Ravens. Those are 3 defenses that have shown that they are elite defenses in the NFL, and the Dolphins have yet to show that they can put up with high number on offense against even a good defense so far this season. So there is some concern in my mind that maybe this Dolphins offense just can't get it done when they're up against good defenses. We also saw last season the Dolphins offense really slowed down in the second half. Perhaps there's something to be said there that defenses sort of figure out over the course of the season what sort of new intricacies the Dolphins have introduced on offense. So we'll see what happens there. I'm just a little bit concerned. I'm not necessarily panicking or trying to dump the entire Dolphins offense, but I do think there is reason to be a little bit concerned there. If you can get like high-end value for either of the guys, if you can get like Chris Olave for Jalen Waddle, I would do that. Or if you can get a running back one for either Achane or Raheem Mostert, I would probably do that. Or if you can get Jamar Chase or AJ Brown for Tyreek Hill, I might consider doing that. Just things like that, nothing crazy, but if you can get like lateral moves for those players at the same position, I'd consider that because the schedule is just really brutal and there is going to be some concern that maybe this offense just can't get it done against these defenses. And finally, I do want to talk about players that have a really tough next month of their schedule. These are players that if you're in a situation where you need to win out, I don't think they're going to do exactly their best at helping you get there. They're players that obviously are good players, all of them, or I wouldn't be talking about them here, but they're players that I think have really tough matchups over the next 4 weeks. They stood out to me as players that I don't expect to put up any sort of league-winning performances here, and that's going to be some concern if you're 3-7, 4-6, 5-5. You need to win out. I think these guys are due for a bit of a down month going forward, even though they are great players. I'll start things off with Christian McCaffrey. I just wanted to mention him. I don't think it necessarily matters with him because he's Christian McCaffrey, but he plays Tampa Bay this week, who have actually notoriously been pretty good at holding Christian McCaffrey in check. Seattle next week, which isn't scary, and then Philadelphia in week 13. That's some cause for concern, and then Seattle again. So I think 2 of the next 4 weeks at least you could see a bit of a down performance from McCaffrey. I'm not necessarily looking to trade him by any means, but like if you're a bad team, if you're 3-7, 4-6, and you have McCaffrey, that means there's probably a lot of holes on your roster. So if you want to consider moving off him to get like 2 or 3 really high-end pieces, I could see that being a good move. Next, I want to mention Alvin Kamara, who unfortunately for him, he's making the list, has really bad next 4 weeks and a bad playoff schedule. So if you're looking at a situation where you maybe just want to move off of Kamara because of his schedule, it's certainly something you could consider. They're on bye this week, which isn't great, and they play the Falcons and the Lions the following 2 weeks. Those are 2 of the best run defenses in the NFL. It's tough to really gauge Kamara in terms of looking at points given up to opposing running backs because he's effectively like an underneath receiver for them. So it's a little bit different for Kamara, but those are good defenses you're going to face after the bye. So I think for the next 3 weeks, I wouldn't at least expect a high-end performance out of Kamara. James Cook, I don't think you can really use him at all for the next month. Obviously, there's some concern that he could even get benched after fumbling this last week. I know he looked great when he got back on the field, although he did fumble again. It sort of bounced back up into his hands. But they play the Jets, who are a really great defense. The Eagles, like I said, who are probably the best run defenses in the NFL. A bye in week 13, and then they play the Chiefs, who are another one of the best defenses in the NFL. So even a month trade of potentially James Cook just not being useful at all. If you can trade him for running back 2 value, I would absolutely do that. I want to mention Keenan Allen. They play Green Bay, the Ravens, New England, and Denver. Against Green Bay, teams just run all over them. Green Bay is not being competitive, so there's some concern, especially with Keenan Allen being banged up. He'll probably be limited all week in practice. You could see the Chargers effectively just lean on their running game. It could be a down week this week, and then next week the Ravens are a really tough matchup. New England, not too bad. Denver, not too bad. So I think just for the next 2 weeks specifically, Keenan Allen could have a bit of a down performance. If you want to sell highs, you can get like a Tyreek Hill or a A.J. Brown for Keenan Allen. It's certainly something I would do because there is some concern with the minor injury to Keenan Allen on top of the sort of just not an optimal schedule over the next couple of weeks. So if you can capitalize on Keenan Allen, I would consider doing it, although I'm not necessarily scared of it. And he's so important to the offense that I'm not worried about him, but I just wanted to mention it. And then Amon-Ra St. Brown, and honestly all of the pass catchers in Detroit, I want to mention them not because these opposing matchups are scary for the Lions, but because they're sort of scary for the pass catchers in that they play Chicago, a really crappy team that you can run on, Green Bay, a really crappy team that you can run on, New Orleans, a mediocre team that you can kind of run on, and then Chicago, another really crappy team that you can run on. So over the next month, I don't think the Lions are going to have any difficulty winning their football games, and that means you're going to see a lot of situations where you're going to probably have David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs combining for 40-plus carries, and it's just going to be really easy for this team to lean on their running game and win their games easily. We know if they can do that, that is how Dan Campbell wants to play. We saw that in I want to say it was week 7 against the Green Bay Packers. We saw David Montgomery get 30-plus carries and score 3 rushing touchdowns. We could easily see that again in week 12. We could easily see the same things happen in week 11 and 14 as well. So if you're banking on the pass-catching options for Detroit, I think you could be a little bit disappointed over the next 4 weeks because they're in situations where they're just not going to have to throw the ball all that much. So that'll do it for this week's buy low or sell high video. I've gone over players that I'm specifically looking to sell high on. Then we sort of looked at the playoff schedules for each of these players. As always, I know I didn't mention every single player's playoff schedule. Just take a look at your roster, look at who those players on your team are going to be playing in the playoffs, see if you're comfortable with those matchups, and see if there's anybody that stands out to you. It's a really healthy exercise just to look and see if you've got players you're not going to be confident in come those playoffs. You want to make sure that you're feeling as good as possible about your roster for those weeks because those are the weeks that really do matter. So I highly recommend you guys do that. It's going to be a super helpful exercise, and it should help you guys just sort of get those trade talks flowing as well, understanding which players you want to be moving and all that. As always, if you guys have any specific trade questions, just let me know in the comments. I love helping you guys do all that. It's one of my favorite things to do here. Thursday morning, you guys will be getting the Thursday Night Football Primer, where I'll preview, finally a good primetime football game between the Baltimore Ravens and the Cincinnati Bengals. Should be a fun game, huge game for the Bengals. It's kind of a must-win for them after losing at home to the Texans. So should be a really fun game, a lot of fantasy-relevant assets there. So I'll make sure I go over all of the players in that game. Then Saturday morning, you guys will get the start-sit video. I'll go over every single other matchup this week and sort of tell you which players should and shouldn't be in your fantasy lineups, what you could expect from each matchup, and who may or may not surprise us this week. So should be a lot of fun there. As always, if you want to make sure you get access to all that, all you've got to do is subscribe to the channel. That way you can help me help you. That way you get all of the I'll make sure you don't miss anything, get access to all this free content that I'm putting out. And then, as always, I just want to ask you guys to please subscribe to the channel. That way you don't miss anything. That way you can just make sure we hopefully hit our goal of 1,000 subscribers by the end of the season. It's been a big goal of mine so far. We need about 10 more each week the rest of the way, 70 more by the end of the season. I think we can get there. It's just going to be a fun push there. So really appreciate all the support. It's been a lot of fun. And with that being said, I'll just catch you next time. Thanks for watching. Peace. Thank you guys for watching. If you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to the channel, like the video, check out these other videos here if you haven't. If you want more content, please feel free to follow me on Twitter at RealSteelFFB. I'll be more active on there as the season goes on. Thanks. Catch you later.